Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW. Today's determined attackers easily bypass even the most advanced network defenses. Trying to ramp up staff to detect their backdoors can cost thousands of dollars and take months, even years. With Active Countermeasures AI Hunter, we enable junior analysts to detect even the most advanced backdoors in a matter of hours. Sign up for a demo and purchase our product today by visiting activecountermeasures.com/ASW. Active Countermeasures. Make every analyst a hunter.
Welcome back, everyone, to Application Security Weekly. This is the news for the week of July 15th. Paul, we got a lot of good stuff in here. I don't know if you happen to see, we mentioned it on Paul Security Weekly last week very briefly. ESLint was stealing some credentials from NPM for users. Did you happen to catch this article at all?
Wait, hold on. So what is ESLint?
So ESLint is a linter for ECMAScript, so JavaScript, as most people would know it.
I'm sorry, define what linting is again. I'm rusty.
So linting is the process of having your code adhere to a set of coding practices, right? So
okay.
You'll use 2 spaces instead of 4 spaces.
Okay.
You will use semicolons at the end of every
Comments will
function.
look like this, and if statements will be structured like this. Yeah. Okay. It's a code
So,
formatting guide. Yeah. Now that you say it, it's called linting.
Yes. So there's all kind of linters out there. There's linters for Python, you name it, there's a linter for it. Well, ESLint happens to be one of those that is, used all over the place. It's used heavily inside of, I think it was Webpack or Babel. It's
will this tell me when I check it in, or is it telling me my IDE, or is it a mixture?
It tells you in your IDE, and then also it will tell you, I should say this, your IDE will actually identify things based on your linter, but also when you go ahead and do things like npm run, it will actually go ahead and then, say you have this many things that are not adhering to your linting rules, etc. Right?
Or in compiled languages at compile time. Yeah,
exactly. So in this case, it was a situation where I think it was ESLint-scope 3.7.2 was where there was effectively a breach, and the actual people that pushed to the npm repository for this found that one of their commit people, or so one of the people that had access rights to push new versions, was actually caught up in, lo and behold, a password dump. And so their credentials were stolen and used to now push a new malicious version of ESLint scope, or ESLint-scope, to NPM. And so what that would cause to occur here is anyone that would have this particular package, which, by the way, I believe it was Babel that uses 3.7.1. And when people set up their package.json file, they can say update on every minor version change. Well, it would auto-update to 3.7.2, and now suddenly you do npm run for your set of packages, or what have you, and boom, you've now had your npm credentials stolen. So I think with this article, it said something like 4,500 potential users were infected with the chance of losing their npm credentials from this. What I found amazing about this, Paul, is we talked about Gentoo 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago at this point. We talked about Arch Linux last week, and now we're talking about NPM. These are all ecosystem-related vulnerabilities, and all of them are vulnerabilities related to password breaches because they weren't using 2-factor authentication. I don't know what to say. What are your thoughts here, Paul?
Yeah, I think we've always seen this style of attack occur in the past. I think we're seeing it more because there's just more projects out there, more people are relying on those projects. I also think it's like a return on investment for the attackers, right?
Yeah.
If I steal one person's credentials, then I can put something in there that steals a whole lot of people's credentials and make a lot of money, right? I think it's really an economic incentive by attacking one particular point or one particular person's credentials is then a force multiplier that gives me the ability to compromise a lot more systems and or people and or software. And I think that's why we're seeing it, right, is just the sheer ability to scale these attacks, especially now where we've got many ecosystems available for that. It used to be like, open source code, we were worried about Linux and Linux libraries and maybe some distributions. Now, I mean, you think about the past 20 years, so many more open source projects and Linux distributions in like we've talked about, software that has an ecosystem built around it that allow people to add these add-ons. So I think it's interesting. It's a very concerning style of attack vector for me.
Well, for what comes out of this in my mind is if you get 4,500 credentials out of this, right? Like that's not a lot of credentials, but if those are all maintainers of other packages, right? Now suddenly what packages do those users have rights to push into and make changes to? So I get the feeling that this is just kind of the tip of the spear attack on what is a broader ecosystem attack, right? Suddenly, if you can get 4,500, what's the exponential scale that you get back from, say, one person has a package that's a reliance or a dependency on something else that is then on something else, which is infected. Now you suddenly have this kind of third order problem of this small infected package that it infects everything else upstream. And who knows how many credentials they get from that or what they do with those credentials, right? Because the other side of this is password reuse. That's a very real problem that we see all over the place. And let's face it, all three of the attacks that I mentioned previously, Gentoo, Arch Linux, and this, could have been prevented with two-factor authentication. I mean, still the password would have been out there. It's something that should have been updated or changed. But again, it's like you have to start controlling, and NPM is probably, needs to start enforcing that if you can go ahead and make changes to the package available on the Node Package Manager, you must have two-factor authentication, right? And I would imagine, in this case, GitHub should probably do something similar, where if your package is relied on as an order of magnitude difference from other packages, or if it's just a very popular open source project, you must have two-factor authentication, because at the end of the day, this is going to really change the landscape. I mean, NPM or Node in this case is taking over from a standpoint of front-end development and some of the back-end development. And eventually it's going to be run in a lot more places than it's otherwise not being run in today.
I mean, the scary part is that over the evolution, if you look at, Unix, right? We had this capability, but we backdoor one binary on one system, right? Like the fear was, how do I know I'm getting clean binaries? Well, back in the day, we installed them from CDs that came from the manufacturer, right? So we're reasonably sure that we had good, clean binaries that hadn't been tampered with. And then as we moved on, all this automatic updating, and so the attack back then was, I broke into one system, I backdoored that, binary. Maybe I tried to spread that binary, but my scope was still limited because I was only replacing binaries on one single system at a time. Fast forward to the new model where all the software is updating automatically. Now, hey, if I can backdoor one piece of code or one program or binary, that gets automatically distributed for me, and I can potentially compromise thousands of systems just from that one attack. And that's really the evolution that we've seen with these attacks. And the problem, in my mind, just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, right? As we have software that is being distributed that then has an ecosystem of plugins that are also being distributed and downloaded. And then so like the further down the chain you go, potentially the weaker it is. If I'm developing a plugin for NPM, it has inherently some capabilities. If I abandon it, if I get hacked, if I whatever, that code ends up getting pushed up and potentially used by other people. I think it's probably one of the most, outside of the software security problem at its core, people developing secure and resilient code. To me, this is right up there with the major problems we face in software development today. And how do you protect that value chain?
Yeah, it's as we've covered in the show many times, like the ability to develop code is now a ubiquitous thing, right? Anyone can go out if they want to. There's plenty of open source, learning tools available to you to go ahead and start learning how to write code and start open sourcing projects, whether it's on NPM or GitHub or what have you. And to that end, yeah, this becomes dangerous pretty quickly when you start to think about the dependency problem. That more than anything, I think, is ultimately what leads to, in the JavaScript world, a very real set of issues where if you're dependent on this other small package that has now been compromised, everything else in your environment is now compromised, which leads to further problems. So hopefully, things like the Node Security Project will help identify some of these things. I hope that the 4,500 credentials that may have been stolen were identified for those users based on npm's oversight of who downloaded when. So that way they can be notified and ultimately maybe have two-factor authentication turned on, or their own repositories then followed.
And the nice part about the way software is distributed and updated today is once you discover the problem, it's a lot more easily fixed. I don't have to mail CDs back out to people. I want to say back in the day, some binaries were Trojaned on CD. Don't quote me on that, but I remember being a Unix administrator back in the day, and you have to get someone to speak authoritatively on that issue. But that was a much harder problem potentially to fix, right? Is you had to, redistribute all the software. Now, I mean, it largely happens automatically. So once we identify those accounts, we identify the software, the fix is pretty straightforward, right? Even enabling two-factor authentication provides a great layer of protection. It's not, the panacea, but certainly helps quite a bit. And so it's that double-edged sword thing, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And now Linux, all these distributions, all these software packages have this great power to automatically distribute and update modules, but that power is being, of course, abused.
Yeah. And speaking of great power and great responsibility, I also wanted to move on to story number 2 under the bugs, breaches, and more. Paul, I don't know if you caught this, but there was a remote iOS bug where effectively users in China with the latest iOS update, in this case, if they started typing in the word Taiwan, it would just shut down their phone. What? And then if they actually would try, someone were to send them an emoji of the Taiwanese flag, it would shut down their phone. So this is actually an article from Objective-C. So Patrick Wardle, thank you very much for this very fun write-up.
I was skeptical until I saw the source.
Yeah. And so it was a remote crash. Let's see here. It was iOS 11.3 on an iPhone 7 was the crash specifically. And it was identified that this user was fully up to date. Everything was working as intended for their device, but then ultimately what ended up happening was they started typing in, the word Taiwan and crash. And so there's actually a video on this particular one that shows this happening. And it was interesting to me, this whole write-up, very, technical, very deep, as is, something that Patrick is very good at. But ultimately, it was, probably something that Apple did at the behest of the Chinese government to be able to sell their device inside of China. Whereby the word Taiwan was totally blacklisted and it would shut off your phone. So
is that really what happened?
Yeah, legit. So it's insane. Like he even says, I was totally skeptical until I absolutely saw this myself. And so this was not even requiring a jailbroken device, right? This could potentially be used to deny service to iPhone users inside of China by people outside of China, right? If I were to send the word Taiwan or the Taiwanese flag to a iPhone 7 user on 11.3 in China, it would shut off their phone. So yeah, I mean, talk about a potential issue for, I don't know, if you think about nation state attacks, right? Suddenly you just mass spam the Taiwanese flag out to a bunch of Chinese numbers and you'll get hits, right? Some of them will be Android, but I wonder what kind of behavior Android has in this case too.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm floored that that's actually what the bug was. That's amazing.
Yeah, amazing and terrible, right? Talk about censorship. But I don't know. It's in the world of history. I mean, again, this is July 16th, 2018. Who knows what will happen in the next 6 months, year, 5 years from now, where maybe China tries to annex Taiwan, totally straight up goes military and does a whole thing where this is just, the slow rollout of taking the idea of Taiwan and just destroying it in terms of their mobile usage on phones, right? You can't even talk about it anymore. So yeah, who knows what's going to come of that? But I thought that was a story that gave me a little bit of pause because Apple would have had to develop that functionality ultimately, right?
And the research that Patrick published is just amazing.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, he gives all the way down to memory addressing and everything, right? So Patrick is incredible. We got to get him on the show at some point, right? He
Yeah, we
is
do. He's been on
a
Pulse Security
premier.
Weekly before, but we do have to bring him on the show for sure.
Yeah. So the other thing about speaking of Apple devices in general, so story number 300 bugs, breaches, and more was a discussion on a $39 device that can now defeat iOS USB restricted mode. So what I found interesting about this is in 11.4.1, there is such a thing as USB restricted mode, which allows a user either via the SOS module, which is, you push that like unlock button 5 times, or just if you haven't unlocked your phone in an hour, where it prevents the iPhone from being brute force attacked by like I think it's Greylock or Grey Key or something. The software that allows you to kind of mass spam PIN numbers to try and unlock phones as used by law enforcement. So this was Apple's response to that privacy invasion of users of the iPhone to say, look, we're just going to simply restrict USB except for charging unless it's been unlocked within the last hour. And so, as it turns out, though, the $39 devices that are USB like dongles, I guess, for lack of a better term, as sold by Apple, can break the reset time on the unlock, right? So if you're a police officer or you're someone that now has a phone that was unlocked within the last hour, but it's now in your possession and it's locked, to prevent USB restricted mode from becoming available or turning on, as it were, you would just plug in this dongle into it and it would reset the timer on that 1 hour. So you now have an extra hour to go ahead and do brute forcing attacks against it. I thought this was crazy, Paul. I mean, maybe an oversight by Apple?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that a lot of these attacks hinge on you got to be in there in the first hour, right?
Yeah.
Everything that I've read it as you got to take possession of the phone within the first hour after being successfully unlocked.
Yep.
Which is kind of, I mean, it's kind of interesting from a law enforcement perspective. Maybe I like that. That's an interesting constraint to have.
Yeah, I mean, and so it's one of those situations where, as law enforcement, effectively, you just need to get pre-approval from a judge to say, look, we're not going to try and unlock the device. We only just want to plug this dongle into it. It's not going to do anything other than just plug it in once every 30 minutes or 59 minutes, right? I'm sure a judge is going to say, yeah, go for it. Not even thinking that this could potentially lead to brute forcing of a phone later. There's speculation that this was simply an oversight by Apple and will eventually be addressed in a future update. But for the time being, I was actually really happy to see Apple respond in this way because they're trying to protect the privacy of their users. They're trying to prevent the use of brute force techniques against their phones as used by some of these third parties that the FBI and others have purchased their product. And so this will be a cat and mouse game for a while, I'm sure. But this is one that I thought was pretty interesting. Paul, I don't know if there's other stories you wanted to jump to. I know that we've still got about 10 minutes. So.
Since CA purchased Veracode, which we've had someone from Veracode on the show, and of course we talk about a lot of their the technology spaces that Veracode is in, and their history in application security, and of course their future in application security, as Veracode was purchased by CA a few years ago. Now what's interesting, an acquisition that I would not have predicted, as we usually don't cover this large of an acquisition because companies in security usually haven't grown to be that large yet. In some cases they have, but I don't often cover acquisitions that are in the multiple of billions. But Broadcom is moving, and this isn't completely done yet, right? I still think they need approval because this article references
because of the size.
Yeah, Broadcom is positioning to buy CA, $18.9 billion cash purchase. $18.9 billion. In cash, which shows you how large Broadcom is. Which I thought was just really, kind of interesting. And they quote definitely that Broadcom was positioning to buy Qualcomm, and the U.S. government said, no, that can't happen.
Potential monopoly.
Monopoly. Right. There's another word for that I was searching for in my brain and it just didn't come to the forefront. Anyway, so Broadcom is poising to purchase CA. Now, the question that was being asked of me in the office today was like, how does that change CA? I'm like, I have no idea.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, Broadcom's primary business is centered around chips. I'm not sure how that might intersect, or if not, with CA. It kind of sounds like this might be an acquisition where CA kind of just goes through business as normal, and not a whole lot changes from the public face, from our perspective, for CA.
Well, so my concern is more than anything from talking to friends that I know at Veracode. When CA bought Veracode, it was kind of a non-event for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was the CA funding round where CA left them alone and allowed them to do what they were good at, right?
Largely, the feedback I get is that's largely consistent today. I haven't seen,
yeah,
and I've been pretty close with this, probably the same people at Veracode, right? It seems business as usual. They're doing great in the marketplace. People like their solutions, and they're continuing to function as basically a wholly owned subsidiary and allowed to function. I'm certain there's been integrations and benefits, and sometimes that's on the sales and marketing side. But I mean, who knows, right?
Yeah, and for me, it'll be interesting for a few things, right? To see if Broadcom does any sort of deduplication of roles inside the organization, right? So if they decide that, you know what, so and so at Veracode, you're effectively a duplicate of this other person who also is a technologist, and so we're just going to replace you with the person that was at CA overseeing all these things, right? So that's always the concern when things like this happen, is what's going to change in terms of management, in terms of the direction of the company, in terms of, just talent that is either pushed out or moves away because now they had stock, and suddenly that's 20 or 25% more valuable, I think, on the day of the initial announcement, right? So any number of things could come of this. The one interesting thing that they cite at the very bottom of the article is that CA has over 1,500 plus patents that fall into Broadcom's hands as a result of this purchase. Now, if this purchase goes ahead, Broadcom suddenly has a whole lot of software patents that, being as big as it is, they could definitely start, throwing their weight around a little bit in terms of people that are doing things with software that are patented by CA, and CA hasn't necessarily moved forward with any sort of legislation or what have you against these other individuals. So,
and I forget where that falls, and you have to go back to my and I think I asked this of Edna Conway on Business Security Weekly. I don't remember exactly, but like an example of protecting intellectual property, a trademark versus a patent. A trademark you pretty much have to defend or you lose it. A patent, I'm not sure that's the same, that falls in the same category. Again, go back and watch our interview with Edna Conway for intellectual property insights as they relate to security, which was a fantastic conversation. She's a CISO at Cisco, and is an attorney. So that was an interesting conversation, and you're right, Keith. I'm not sure that how much CA has enforced or cares to enforce, and how that plays into the whole patent world. I honestly don't remember. Yeah. I should remember that. I think I asked her the question, but
it's all good. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what comes of this. When I saw it happen, it gave me a little bit of pause, only because like the CA Veracode relationship was really strong, and it didn't seem like there was a lot of putting their fingers in the pudding, as it were. And now it makes me wonder what will happen with Broadcom. So stay tuned, I guess. What other stories did you want to cover, Paul? I had a couple of learning and tools I wanted to go over, but we can do those at the end.
Well, I was interested in your learning and tools, actually, especially the Burp Suite one.
Yeah, this one was cool. So it's a project called Burpa, or Burp Automator. So it is out on GitHub. It is linked under number 3 for learning and tools this week. It's an entire test suite that it uses Jenkins to automate, Selenium and all your other testing. But then it has this Burpa plugin that throws it into Burp Suite Pro and automates that as part of your test suite, right? So this is kind of your user acceptance testing / perhaps maybe even a little bit of unit testing if you think about it. But it will automate and actually produce a scan report. And in this case, some of the like plugins that they have is it actually shows a Slack integration that allows you to dump into Slack this report that is produced by Burp Suite Pro as part of a scan, right? So now you can not only take your Burp Suite Pro licenses as used by your testers, but if you actually now want to automate some of that testing that Burp Suite Pro can do, which is handy, maybe not the best automated tester because it's kind of a pseudo manual testing environment that you're using with Burp Suite Pro, but hey, it's one more tool in your toolbox that you can now throw at your applications and see what falls out. So I was excited by this when I saw it because it just means that I'll be able to automate even more things, perhaps even my own test suites, as it were. Paul, did you plan on using this internally at all? I know that you guys don't necessarily do things that are publicly facing, but hey, right, doesn't hurt.
Yeah, it's certainly something to look into. I think that the continuous integration and continuous testing tools they're so vast, and it's a lot of tool fatigue that you go through in choosing the right ones. So,
for sure, yeah, no, that's the absolute truth. I did actually just want to jump to the last story that I mentioned there at the top of the section, which was food for thought number 2. It's an article on how IT operations as a process is broken today, because we have your ServiceNows and you have your Jiras and you have all sorts of other ticketing systems, those two being, in my mind, the biggest. And it talks a little bit about how ops on the DevOps side has to deal with people going in and creating a ticket. And that increases communication problems, which increases delays of feedback to the development. And suddenly your feedback loop is broken. So it was a great article that it covers. So the article by Damon Edwards, it covers a whole lot of different situations from, what is wrong with the ticket problem, what sort of things they do, like encouraging bottlenecks. That is one of the things that the DevOps handbook says, look, any optimizations that you make either before the bottleneck or after the bottleneck are pointless. They are totally meaningless because the bottleneck ultimately is your limitation. And your
bottleneck could be the fact that you have to create a ticket. Now, ticketing systems are designed to help you overcome those bottlenecks and increase your effectiveness in those processes. But oftentimes I find if they're not used correctly, they can be a bottleneck. And then you'll work, like you said, Keith, you're trying to work around that bottleneck. But the bottleneck is, well, every time this particular condition is met, I have to file a ticket, and then someone has to act upon that ticket. We've done like exactly that. We're designing to get rid of certain types of ticketing in our system, because I really think that, and this is just my philosophy in one particular, tickets might work for you, whatever. I think Damon makes a pretty bold statement in saying tickets make operations unnecessarily miserable. I certainly think there's a lot of scenarios that can play into that. And so I think in tickets, I like tickets for trouble tickets. Like there is a problem. I have to create a ticket so someone can address that problem. Then it should help you track the solution to that problem. Tickets that are part of an operational process, I feel like that a lot of times they can get in the way, right? Like,
oh, absolutely.
If there's always a reoccurring condition, like why are we filing a ticket and having someone act on that? Like someone has information that someone needs to take an action on, and it's a regular process. I feel like that's a different system, right? Like that should just be in a system that's already allowing them to do their work, right?
Well, really, really good example of that is if I'm a developer and I want to have an integration or a staging environment test suite run, if I have to create a ticket after I've completed my unit tests to get that done every time, it's ripe for automation, right? So here's a situation where if I have to put in a ticket every time I need to request a staging environment, the process is already broken. And I like the way that you put it, Paul, is if it is a problem, right? It is a problem in terms of a feature request that needs to come in to fix something, a bug that needs to be remediated. Maybe we need to provision more allocated, resources to that AMI or to whatever because the feature functionality is requiring more of them. Okay, those are one-off instances, but if you are getting regular tickets to request a scan, to request an environment build, to do anything that should be a regular part of your process, you're using them wrong. So I wholly agree with kind of your approach on this, which is if it's a problem, tickets make sense. If it's a process, don't use tickets, automate it. Or get your ops people using version control and automate it that way. I think the development environments are certainly more akin to tickets, but in other environments, you're probably abusing
some of those ticket things. And I think that you maybe want to have your developers write some software that's fostering your process in a better way than a ticketing system. Also, I think on a positive note for tickets, you don't want to necessarily use email and other communications for something that needs to be tracked as a ticket.
Right.
We've had a lot of those conversations, over the years here at Security Weekly, as to if you're managing a process inside email, probably not the best case to do that, because the ticketing, the value is being able to track that activity. It's a huge value in a ticketing system, but there are ways in which you can use it, improperly, right? Like just get the information where it needs to go, and don't force, you can short circuit that ticket process in a lot of cases.
Yeah, which removes bottlenecks, speeds up, development time, feedback loops, and obviously allows everybody to learn in the process.
Right.
Speaking of all of that, I did want to talk about this week's commit strip comic, which is Pareto everywhere. So for those that don't know, the Pareto principle says, effectively identifying the 20% of work that gets you 80% of the results. And then everything after that 20% is marginal gains thereafter. So for our listeners, I thought that they would appreciate that, especially for the developers out there that say, hey, man, I finished 20% of the feature. We're good. So I thought I would throw that one in there for this week. So with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git, commit, and stay classy.